Welcome back, friends, followers, and aviation enthusiasts, to another video. Today we are going to talk about the Aerosoft A330 again, but this time with a different approach. I have made a list of all the bugs that I encountered during a couple of flight sessions, and in this video I'm going to show you all these bugs one by one. The main purpose of the video is to provide the Aerosoft development team a review about the bugs, how they happen, what the actual behavior is, and what the expected behavior should be. I'm a software developer myself, and I think providing the team with a feedback from my perspective might be helpful after all. And let me clarify one thing, I'm not a real airline pilot. There are some certain things about the aircraft and its systems that I don't understand. If you guys know better than me, please comment that down below. I mainly flew the A320 family in the simulator, so there is some behavior that is expected to work in a similar way in this aircraft. In the end, it's an Airbus, and these aircraft are very similar in one or another way. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting with the first bug, and that is the initial state of the aircraft. Because this is definitely not a cold and dark state. The primary flight display is on, the upper ECAM display is on, and all the rest of the displays are off. I think, in my opinion, the plane should always start in a cold and dark state, especially if you are starting at a gate. And if you take a closer look at the EFB, you will notice that some cargo doors are open, one door is open, the second left door, and chocks and cones is fine, but the doors shouldn't be open in a cold and dark state. So the actual behavior is the plane is in a completely unknown state, and the expected behavior is cold and dark, at least at the gate. Next thing on the list is in the EFB settings. The problem with the settings is they are not persisted. So as soon as you set up stuff like IRS alignment time to instant or altimeter synchronization to all, if you do a couple of flight sessions, you will notice that they are reset to default. Thankfully, this is not the case for the hardware calibration, but general settings and aircraft settings are sometimes just reset to default. I expect these settings to be persisted and saved into a file, which then will be loaded up at the next flight session. It happens sometimes, but sometimes they are just reset to default, like I said before. Next bug on the list is still in the settings of the EFB, and that is if you decide to turn off the virtual keyboard and start typing in some numbers, for example your SimBrief ID, I would expect the flight simulator controls to be deactivated. For example, I have on the number 1 numpad a custom view that is loaded when I just press that button. The problem is that if you enter your SimBrief ID, hit the numpad 1 key, you will be loading this custom view instead of typing 1. It is typing 1 and it is typing in general, but the simulator controls are still active. So what I expected here to do is deactivate the simulator controls if the mouse cursor or the focus is on a text input field like the SimBrief ID. Alright, let's talk about the pushback tool. And I'm not talking about the manual pushback, I'm talking about the automatic pushback, where you just can plan your pushback and just start it. It's not a bug, and the pushback works even fine. The problem is, it's a horrible user experience. You will not understand directly how to use this tool. I'm asking myself one question: why didn't they integrate the Toolbar Pushback Pro add-on from Aerosoft themselves into this EFB? It would have been much easier, because this one has a great user experience. And to make things worse, if you then decide to start the pushback, your nose gear will be lifted up, which is like in reality, but the problem is it will happen until your tail strikes the ground. And it even happens without you releasing the parking brakes, which I think doesn't make any sense. There's one addition. As you may have noticed, there is no pushback tug connected to the airplane, which is kind of strange given the fact that Aerosoft is using the default Microsoft Flight Simulator ground services. So expected behavior here is wait for the parking brake to be released, then lift the nose gear up a certain amount of degrees. Next thing on the list is the use separate tiller axis setting. Whenever I set this to on, I expect when I use nose wheel steering, which is set up to my joystick, I expect it to move the tiller, animate the tiller, and move the nose wheel to the left or to the right. Even if I press the pedal disconnect button or release the button, nothing is happening. The tiller is always not animated at all. So expected behavior is if I set this to on and if I have a nose wheel steering set up in my joystick, I expect it to move the tiller left or right. And of course move the nose wheel to the left and to the right, respectively. Coming up next are the ground services, which you can also set up in your EFB. And I'm talking about the catering truck and the baggage truck. I didn't try the refueling, I never used it to be honest. But if you take a closer look, if you request the catering truck, well, the animation is fine, everything is perfectly aligned. One thing is still missing, which should happen, I think, and that is the respective door should be opened automatically. And the same goes for the baggage service. If you take a closer look at the animation, the baggage truck is aligned with the cargo door, but the cargo door is closed. So if you try now to open the door, you will see that it will smash into the truck. I don't think that should be like that. It should be like the catering truck. If you request a baggage truck, then the cargo door should be opened automatically before the baggage truck connects to your plane. Next thing on the list is the Navigraph integration in the EFB. If you take a look at one chart, for example this airport chart right here, and try to rotate it, it will work perfectly fine. But if you press the rotate button twice, you will notice that the chart will be stuck in a specific angle. I don't know why this happens, but it looks kind of strange to me. To me personally, I don't care about these Navigraph integrations in the EFB. I always use the Navigraph application itself, but there are a lot of people that are using it, so I think this should be relevant too. So expected behavior is if you press the rotate button twice or even more to rotate the chart preview faster, then the chart shouldn't be stuck at a specific angle like it is shown here. And the next thing is the flight plan information. If you fetch that from SimBrief and take a look at the information, specifically the weather data, there are text inputs where you can just put an ICAO code of your airport, or if you decide to fetch weather data from a different airport, you would just click on the text input field and enter the ICAO code of your airport. The problem is if you accidentally click on one of these text inputs and then click away, they will be emptied. I don't know why. The weather data stays the same, but the text input field will be emptied. So expected behavior is if you click on a text input field where there is text inside and you do not change the value of that text, just leave the text as it is. Another annoying thing is if you try to load a specific state in your EFB, you might have a WASM module crash, or even worse, your sim will just freeze. If you go to the task manager and take a look at the simulator, it just states that it's not responding anymore. Expected behavior here, of course, is no sudden crashes and no sudden freezes. Now taking a look at the bottom and specifically at the speed brake lever. Now you can calibrate your lever in your EFB, and if you decide not to do that, that's totally fine for you. I don't need that because I have the Thrustmaster Airbus throttle quadrant where the speed brake lever is exactly aligned with the lever in my simulator. But there is one thing, and that is if you retract your speed brakes to a 0 position, they will be armed automatically. This is not exactly how it should work. If your lever is set to retract or 0, the lever should stay in that position and should not be armed automatically. I have a button which I use to arm the speed brakes. It's not a big issue to be honest, but it's something I noticed. This will maybe annoy a couple of people because as soon as you arm your speed brakes, you will have an ECAM message showing that. So expected behavior is pretty obvious here too. If you have your levers set to retract or 0, arm the speed brakes until the user or the pilot does so. Taking a look at the overhead panel, of course there are some buttons that are not implemented, which is fine, but there also are buttons which are implemented. I mean, at least they are clickable and you can even hear the click sounds. For example, the flight control buttons Prim1, Sec1, Prim2, Sec2 and Prim3. These buttons are guarded. If you unguard them, press the button, you will notice the animation, you will hear a click, but the light is not illuminated. So you will never know if this button is actually turned on or turned off. Now you could say, okay, maybe these buttons are not implemented after all, but remember, there is an annunciator light test button in the bottom right of the overhead panel. And if you switch that button to test, you will suddenly see that all the lights are illuminated. So why not just translate the actual state to these lights? I mean, in the end, it's an on-off switch, which is a Boolean value of 0 or 1. So the expected behavior in this case is pretty obvious, isn't it? Still on the overhead panel, like I said before, a couple of buttons are not implemented. One example is the cabin call buttons. There are 6 of those buttons in this airplane. So if you want to do a takeoff, press on the takeoff config test button, then you will notice that the cabin is not ready yet. Why not just activate one button, which is the all cabin call button? If you press that button, this will then make the cabin prepare itself, and then in your ECAM memo you will see cabin is ready. There is of course a workaround, and that is if you turn on your transponder to auto or on, your cabin will be prepared automatically. Expected behavior here is of course at least one cabin call button, which is not a big issue, but it's still something noticeable. Another thing I noticed is, which is not a big issue to be honest, if you take a look at your lower ECAM display, specifically the flight control page, and try to move the flight controls with your joystick and your rudder pedals, for example, you will notice that they are kind of delayed. The indicators in the display are delayed, and you will have the impression that they are running with like 15 frames or 20 frames per second, which is, like I said, not a big issue. You will notice that. Next category is the sounds. I'm not an expert of how a Pratt & Whitney engine of the A330 should sound like, but one thing that I noticed for sure is if you go to the external view, move the camera around while the engines are running, you will barely hear the engines. They are very, very quiet. Even if you spool up the engines by giving full throttle, they are really, really quiet. I'm not gonna talk about the cockpit sounds. I don't know how they should sound. So this is it for this category. If you decide to go inside the cabin, the sound is also very, very quiet. The next one is kind of a funny one, to be honest. You all may know these 2 red circles that are right in the middle of your 2 windscreens. This middle area right there where the standby compass is. So these red circles are indicators for the captain or the first officer whether they are seated correctly in the cockpit. But if you take a look at them, there's actually one thing missing, and that is a white circle. So the white circle should be exactly aligned with the red ones if you are sitting correctly. But if you take a closer look and move the camera around, you will notice that the white circle is actually behind the red circles instead of being in front of them, which is kind of funny. So yeah, not a big issue I think, but I mean, come on guys, this is a really simple thing to do. And while we are in the middle of the screen, and the standby compass is not working. It's always showing the north. If you turn left, it's still showing the north. If you turn right, it's still showing the north. So at least this should be working, or at least even better, in some airplanes you can hide this standby compass. Why not just hide it? Why show a compass that isn't even functioning? Another small thing that I noticed, I might be wrong, but if you release the parking brakes, watch what happens to the brake pedals and watch what happens to the brake pressure. Now the brakes are pressed down, so you can clearly see there is braking pressure in this indicator on the right. Now if I release the parking brake, the brake pedals will be released and the pressure goes back to 0. And if I engage the parking brake again, brake pedals are pressed and you can see there is brake pressure again. This might be even correct. I'm not sure about the A330. I know that this is not the case in the A320 family, at least I didn't notice that. I might be wrong, so please comment that if you guys know better than me. Another thing that I noticed is if you watch the primary flight display, specifically the chosen altitude here in blue, now it's at 5,000 feet, and if I play around with that a little bit and increase it, you will see that it will turn to magenta for a split second and then to blue again. This happens only if the managed mode is selected. If you select the open descent or open climb mode in this case, which doesn't make any sense either, this is not the case. It will stay blue, but if you are in managed mode, it will turn into magenta for a split second, which is kind of strange, to be honest. Another small thing that is worth mentioning is if you watch the lower ECAM, I am right now starting the engines 2 and 1, and the electrical generators will be available generating electricity even before the engines are available. And if you don't have the lower ECAM open, you will notice that by hearing a clack sound. Now the next topic is a little bit too complex, and I'm not an expert in hydraulic systems, but I think we can all agree that all the flight surfaces work with hydraulics. And if somehow all of your hydraulic systems are turned off or have low pressure or a leak, or at least let's say they are in amber like it is shown in the ECAM, you will never have the ability to control the aircraft anymore. But not in this aircraft, because if you turn off the green, blue and yellow hydraulic systems, you will still have the ability to steer the aircraft, even pitch up and down, roll to the left or to the right, and even yaw to the left or to the right. So for some reason your ailerons, your elevator and your rudders will still work and the airplane will still be steerable and controllable. You may notice a slight difference between the flight control surfaces with the hydraulics turned off and the flight control surfaces with hydraulics turned on, but they are still working somehow. I don't know why, but this kind of makes no sense. What makes sense is that the flight control surfaces are not animated anymore, which is completely fine. But even if they are not animated, you can still control your aircraft. Do not ask me why, I don't know. So expected behavior in this case is, of course, if all of your hydraulic systems fail, your flight controlled surfaces should not move, which is the case, and your aircraft should not be controllable anymore. I think we can all agree that if all of your 3 hydraulic systems fail, your chances of survival are really low. Now the next bug is one of the worst bugs I have ever seen in this simulator, and that is, you might have already guessed it, that you cannot land the airplane in most of the times. Now the reason for this is that as soon as your main landing gear has ground contact, the airplane suddenly accelerates and you will get a speed increase by 30 to 40 knots, which then will generate lift. The plane will bounce a little bit, then on second contact with the ground again, the plane will increase its speed, which then generates lift again, and so on and so forth. This makes the plane almost unlandable, and if you decide to take off with this plane, no one will and can guarantee you a safe landing, not even the best pilots in the world. Now this increase of speed behavior happens also if you, for example, do a landing and then hit the brakes. If you smash the brakes to max manual braking, the same will happen. Let me demonstrate that for you in a takeoff. So I'm gonna hold down the brakes, give 50% of thrust, release the brakes. Let's just take off or pretend to take off. I'm gonna cancel the takeoff if we reach 80 knots. Let's reduce thrust. And now watch the brakes. If I now brake, release, brake, release, brake, release, all the time, we are getting faster and faster and faster until we launch into air, which doesn't make any sense. In my opinion, this bug should have been marked as a release blocker because it makes the plane almost useless. And I'm wondering how the product owner approved this release with this critical bug included. You cannot tell me that this was not tested. I mean, if we flight simmers try a new plane, what do you think we will try to do first? Well, you guessed it, taking off and of course landing, among other things. After experimenting with the airplane, I might have found out that this bug is the main reason why a lot of other players were launched into space when they played with the time in the weather panel. And before you can connect the dots, there is still one piece of the puzzle missing. Now to understand this, we need to take a look at the fuel page because I found out something very strange. We now have 8,000 kilos of fuel in our tanks. If you play around with the time and set it to the past, you will suddenly notice that your airplane just gained fuel, and that the fuel used indicator in the ECAM now has a negative value. Now if you set it to the future, your plane fuel will just decrease. If you set the time to the present time again, you will have the same amount of 8,000 kilos. But this behavior happens only if you hold the mouse over the time slider and move it back and forth. If you click on the slider, this will have no effect. And guys, we are getting closer to solving the mystery. Now if you try to refuel the airplane in your EFB with a big amount of fuel, what you might notice is that the plane will suddenly become very heavy. And this can't be overseen because it makes a sudden move to the bottom. You know what I mean? Now, if you are on the ground and play around with the time very fast, your plane will suddenly get very heavy. It might even do a really small jump. And if that happens, the main landing gear will lose ground contact for a very small amount of time and then gets ground contact again. And do you remember what happens if your plane gets ground contact? You guessed it, it will accelerate. And the faster you change the time, the higher your speed gets, which then launches you into space. It's completely logical that your plane does this jump on the ground, because if you set the time to the future very fast, you will get light very fast, and if you set it to the past very fast, you will get very heavy very fast. And if you do that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth very fast, your plane will just make this kind of jumps. You might not notice that, but I think this is the main reason why these things happen in the first place. One small addition is that this bug happens only on the ground and only if the plane is moving. If you try it in the air, it won't happen. Of course, these are not all of the bugs that this airplane has. We didn't even start talking about the primary flight display, the navigation display, the MCDU and the autopilot, so the avionics in general. If I do that, we will end up in a very long video. So this is just to give you guys an idea about the airplane, kind of a second review. And in my first review we already took a look at the areas that I just mentioned. So if you like, you can watch this almost 2-hour review. I will put a link in the description. I hope that this video will be helpful to the developers and that you guys enjoyed it. So thank you very much for watching. If you found this content helpful, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and see you guys in the next one. Or maybe not. Goodbye.